Welcome to the Against Nice podcast, where we believe people who try to be nice are truly trying to be cruel. But we do believe in kindness, where people have other people's interests at heart, but they're also willing to say the things that are tough to say. That's what we talk about on the Against Nice podcast. There is a distinction between kindness and niceness. Thanks for joining us today. By the way, you can support us by going to glow.fm/against nice. That's glow.fm/against nice. You can do a monthly contribution there as a member. Also, you can do a one-time gift. So you can support us well there. And thank you also to all our sponsors. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce our guest today. Bruce Gore is really kind of a man of all trades. I ran across Bruce on YouTube because I'm kind of geeky about things, listening to issues related to science, mathematics, but also philosophy and theology. I kind of spend some portion of my morning listening to what someone else has to say other than me. I ran across Bruce through the YouTube timeline. You can find him there, Bruce Gore. He's from Spokane, Washington. His biography will be in the link and in the show notes, so make sure you check those out. But he taught at the former Moody Bible Institute Northwest in Spokane. He got his law degree from Gonzaga University there, was a lawyer until 2002 when he retired, and then taught at Oaks Classical Christian Academy there in Spokane. He's now fully retired since about 2014. Now, he's a former Baptist turned Reformed Presbyterian. He was challenged, and he'll talk about more about this, but he was challenged while teaching at this classical academy that about finding connections of history in the Bible. Turned into something really dramatic and I think very useful for the Christian, for even Jewish believers, because there's a lot of information there that helps correlate where the actual connections between history and the Bible. So I wanted to have a discussion with him about that. We kind of hit at the roots of the American Constitution a little bit, talk a little bit about theological perspectives and how they've affected culture. Of course, United States has been highly informed by the Judeo-Christian ethic. Well, where are we at right now with all that? And what's the consequence of all the changes that are taking place? We kind of hit on some of these topics, and then I catch a few special key aspects of those historical connections with history. So you're going to enjoy this podcast. Bruce is pretty solid. Again, I do want to ask for your support of our podcast, Against Nice. Glow.fm/against nice. So without further ado, here's Bruce Gore and me talking. All right, I want to welcome everyone to the podcast today. We have a professor, and I'll let you clarify that as much as you want, Bruce Gore from Spokane, Washington on. Folks, I've run across Bruce's work on YouTube, and I think there's some fascinating stuff that a lot of people don't think through when it comes to how does the Bible really connect in history, and what are the implications of that knowledge? I mean, most people don't have that knowledge, and Bruce has spent a lot of time developing that knowledge, and so I wanted to bring him on the podcast today. And so welcome, Bruce. I really appreciate you taking some time. Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate you having me on. You bet.
Thanks. So give people a little background about you. You've got a very varied history. I think you've gone through a few different things. You've gone through a teaching career and a legal career, but give people a quick summary of who you are.
Still trying to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up,
Yeah, so, exactly.
At 75 years old, I figure I better settle down and do something here. But
that's right.
Yeah, I when I first got out of college, it was in the early 70s, and I was a newsman for a while. So I was in media. ran around and interviewing people and so on. But I'd always had a kind of a side interest in Bible and teaching. I grew up in a Christian home, Baptist, in fact, and so out of college, I kind of bluffed my way into a little school that started here in Spokane called Inland Empire School of the Bible. It doesn't exist anymore. It was purchased eventually by Moody. So it was a Moody school for a while, and then it's locally owned again. But I was there for about 7 years. And that's kind of where I got it under my skin that I wanted to teach. These were post-high school kids, but most of them were new converts, just fresh off the turnip truck. This was kind of the end of the Jesus movement, so we got some of the people out of that particular culture. So it was a very interesting, kind of fun time for me.
Kind of early to mid 70s, right? Correct.
Yeah, this was early to mid 70s, exactly. And so what happened, oddly enough, your viewers probably are familiar with the term dispensationalism. The school was heavily committed to that particular eschatological outlook. And that was, in fact, the view I held at the time when I just got out of college. And over the course of about 7 or 8 years of teaching and being required to, I became increasingly troubled at what I viewed as so many loose ends and so much special pleading and really interpretive jumps that just I couldn't quite justify except by taking somebody's word for it, and so it was troubling, and it was kind of along the way. You know the name R.C. Sproul, I suppose.
Of course, absolutely.
About 4 or 5 years into that career at the school, I came across a couple of cassettes by him. This was way back. These were early R.C. Sproul tapes. He made them at Ligonier Valley Study Center, which was in Stallstown, Pennsylvania. So it's before they moved to Orlando. So this was kind of the early raw R.C. But the guy just it was almost I would say supernatural, the way that he kind of addressed all the issues that have been troubling me so much. So in 1980. I actually resigned on good terms with the school, but I told them I just couldn't teach this view without mental reservation. And that's what they required you do. Sign every year a document, no mental reservation about pre-tribulation, premillennial, whatever, all of that stuff. And so I actually spoke at graduation that fall, or that spring, but nevertheless, that was the end of that. So I was kind of bounced out of a job, needed something to do. So I went to law school and practiced law for about 20 years. And in the process of practicing law, I also had the chance to teach at Whitworth University, which is my alma mater, adjunct. I was never full-time, but taught out there a variety of courses, the Book of Romans, ethics, some history, that kind of thing. And so that was really a great experience, and it kind of solidified my own understanding, I would say, of things. In 19 or around the year 2000, I closed down my law practice and went back to teaching. And this was at a classical Christian school here in Spokane called the Oaks. I was teaching high school kids, upper division high school. And one of the first jobs they handed me was to teach a course they wanted to call Historical Context of the Bible. And I thought, well, I know something about historical context of the Bible. How hard can it be? I've heard of the Persians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians. So I figure I could bluff my way through. And what I found out was when you stand up 5 days a week in front of a bunch of pretty bright high schoolers, you run out of material a lot sooner than you thought you would. And so that spurred my interest in taking a deeper look at it. So really, I wrote a book on it, but it was driven. I couldn't find a good textbook, so I started assembling stuff, and I thought, well, I'm not enough of an expert to really have critical apparatus at my disposal, but I can at least take a look at what seemed to be the most widely accepted secular scholarly views of ancient chronology and lay it down against what's widely viewed as acceptable biblical chronology, put the two timelines beside each other and see, if anything makes sense. And so that's basically what I did. So I wrote a book that became a textbook eventually, that was really trying to do that. It's not groundbreaking research, but it did force me to kind of get into the issues and read some good material. And so that was kind of the genesis of the one and only book that I've ever written or ever will write. But anyway, that got me into that field.
I don't know. You probably could, if you're looking for stuff to do. There's a whole lot of material to relate all this to current understanding and even bring it today. In fact, I'm going to want to talk a little bit about that in this. But it's so funny. You and I, we're just getting to know one another. You and I have such a similar background.
Really?
I was bought in to the dispensationalism as well. I came to Christ in 1981 as a 16-year-old kid at a boarding school in Tennessee called the Webb School. Just miraculous kind of experience. I got turned on to R.C. Sproul some years later. I found that I was being reformed, and oddly, it was kind of Charles Stanley's fault, even though he always was fighting against the Calvinists in the Baptist church. But because he said, well, if you're not walking in it, well, then you ain't it, and anyway,
right.
It's just an interesting transformation. But yeah, dispensationalism, man, I've really found it hard to force myself into this way of thinking. And even though I wouldn't say that I'd eschew everything that people say on eschatology, because I think we don't really understand what the end times are going to be precisely. There's a lot to understand, but beyond the eschatological implications of dispensationalism, all of the explanations of how we got here just really did seem. Special pleading is a very good word that you say. There's a lot of that in dispensationalism. But I think what's worse is that it causes us not to understand Scripture.
Yeah.
And I think for the Christian, that's the key aspect of these problems. So would you not agree with that? A lot of problems in our society right now.
We all do this. We all are driven to some degree by our presuppositions. So I'll just, acknowledge that right off the bat. But there's really a truckload of presuppositions that dispensational tends to bring to the Bible in order to reach the conclusions it has to reach. And sometimes it involves a fair amount of imaginative, interpretive work. For example, just one example that comes to mind, you think of the so-called 70 weeks of Daniel. So there you go. Daniel chapter 9, 70 weeks, 490 years. And dispensationalism, in order to construct a scheme for the end times, says the 70th week of Daniel was detached from the first 69. Well, okay, I hear you say that, and I can see why you'd want to say it, and I see how it makes your eschatological outlook work. But just exactly how did you reach the conclusion that it's legitimate to take the last week and move it out thousands of years into the future? There's certainly nothing in the text that would suggest you are warranted in doing that. And it's that kind of thing. The thing that actually loosened my mortar the most was the repeated and emphatic New Testament teaching that the seed of Abraham are people with faith in Christ. And there's a specific repudiation of some special, distinct status for Jewish people as such. They're just one more set of human beings like the rest of us who need mercy and need grace. And from the New Testament point of view, there is no difference between Jew and Greek. And if there is no difference between Jew and Greek, the whole substructure of dispensationalism collapses on the spot, because they maintain that there is a distinction and that God is going to return to a program oriented to ethnic Jewish people in the world. The tribulation, the millennium are all going to involve ethnic Jewish people. And you just have to say, where is that in the New Testament? If anything, it's something the New Testament specifically repudiates as a way of thinking about how God works in history. So, that was really at the heart of my problems with it. But I think there's a bunch of other issues. Now, I'll agree. I come to the Bible, I'm a Calvinist, so when I come to the Bible, I know I've got my Calvinistic lens on, but at least I try. as best I can before God to say, help me not just be driven by what I already think the Bible says. Let me take a step back, hear it. And if it says something that jars me, don't just run from it, but think it through. I think that's the way we have to study the Bible if we're going to make any progress in understanding it.
Well, and by the way, we both love R.C. Sproul and we're greatly benefited from that. He always talked about this problem sometimes of being held into your love lines, as a terminology he would use quite a bit.
Yeah.
And we're not trying to come with this. I don't want to get overly philosophical for those who don't understand philosophy, but we're not trying to go to the Bible with a tabula rasa, type of approach where whatever the Bible throws at us as we're reading it is what is and how we go. No, there are some established things there, but we do have to go pulling out a lot of predefined notions that we have been taught through our love lines. And it doesn't matter if it's Reformed or Arminian or whatever perspective you come from, when you draw that in too closely, I mean, there are some established things that we know, but when you draw that in too closely, you can't make sure that you're not being conformed in that manner. That, I think, gets, by the way, let's back up for a little bit. Dispensationalism, a definition of dispensationalism. For the people who know philosophy out there, I take dispensationalism as being interestingly close to a Hegelian dialectical approach.
Interesting,
to history. I mean, if you really think about it, which, by the way, Marx, and I'm not saying that dispensationalists are Marxists, but Marxism takes from the Hegelian dialectic, which is this cyclical approach to history, almost a Yeatsian approach to it, the widening gyre of history that keeps, and that also, I think it takes to, and with respect to dispensationalists, many of whom I'm sure love Christ and want to expand the gospel. But I think that they take with a very worldly perspective of how history goes about. So give people a definition of dispensationalism, just for those who may not have approached it, at least by that name.
Yeah, that is a great question, and a little bit more complex than a person might suspect, because it has evolved profoundly over the years. So if you ask what was dispensationalism originally, as John Darby, let's say back in the early 1800s, crafted it, and then as it was kind of popularized by C.I. Scofield, you would say that early form of dispensationalism was vastly further afield from traditional Orthodox Christianity than people might suspect. For example, the original Scofield Reference Bible, early 20th century, actually taught that in other dispensations, people were saved by law, by what it meant to be under the dispensation of the law. We're under the dispensation of grace. There's going to be the dispensation of the kingdom. And the original idea was every one of these dispensations, 7 altogether, by usually under dispensational thought, has a different system by which a person can be saved. Well, that in itself would represent a pretty dissonant idea compared to traditional Christian understanding of all 3 branches: Catholic, Eastern, Protestant. None of them would have really countenanced such an idea. It was rather a novel, new notion. Well, even dispensationalists over the years became a little embarrassed by that, and it was gradually adjusted. So Ryrie, for example, wrote a book in the late 60s, early 70s called Dispensationalism Today, in which he modified a whole lot of that, really cleaned house quite a bit, and made dispensationalism substantially more orthodox than it had been earlier.
Quick side note, my very first Bible was a Ryrie study Bible.
Oh, there you go.
Just to tell you how I got that. Now, by the way, it was New American Standard Version, and I'm definitely still, even though I love there are some other good ones. That's I'm still
right.
There, but
and Ryrie's a good scholar. I'm not trying to
great scholar.
him. But he was trying to keep at least one foot solidly in the dispensational world while trying to adjust some of the more embarrassing elements. Well, so you say if you look at what it is today, then it probably mainly boils down to how a person sees the end times, that some of the more extravagant views of the prior dispensations, the age of civil government, the age of conscience, the age of this and that, don't have quite as much traction as they once did, but they hold quite emphatically to an end time scenario, which usually means there's going to be a rapture. For the most part, it's understood it's a so-called pre-tribulation rapture, and that is going to issue forth a time of great trouble in the world, in which Israel, the state of Israel, presumably the current state of Israel, is going to be the centerpiece. The church is gone. Christians are gone. That in itself is astonishing, but it's still part of traditional dispensational thought, that there's going to be some great Armageddon type war that'll take place. Christ comes back, in a sense, to rescue his people and establishes an earthly kingdom. That's still pretty much intact in dispensational thought. And so I think even a contemporary dispensationalists, while they've adjusted some of their views, and probably still hold pretty tightly to that kind of end times structure of how they view it.
Yeah, I'm going to want to I definitely want to get in, as we move on here, to some of the history that you've researched related to Old Testament scripture, because there's so much there and a lot of interesting things that people, probably most Christians, don't know of how history ties in to what they're reading in scripture. But before we get down that path, just to pick up on what you're talking about, how is it that we got to this place where this sort of eschatological approach became so prevalent in the church, in the West in particular, but really worldwide, if you think about it, over the last 200-300 years? How is it that we got there? Because that is not the way most people thought before that time in the church history.
Yeah, it was a funny kind of combination of forces. The turn of the 20th century in America, of course, was the general furor at the time in the Christian world was called the modernist controversy. The modernist controversy was largely the mixing of what had become pretty well established European liberalism in the Christian world, mixing with basically evangelical Christianity in the States, conservative Christianity. And that particular form of viewing the Christian faith, which tended to minimize the miraculous, tended to minimize human sinfulness, tended to place more of an accent on simply the Christian ethic as opposed to an atoning sacrifice offered by Christ. All of that met with a huge amount of negative reaction in the States. And it appeared that the seminaries especially were beginning to be increasingly influenced by that kind of liberal or modernist view that was being shipped over from the continent. And so there was a lot of the Scopes trial, 1925. There were events that took place that exacerbated the problem, but that was kind of what was going on. Well, it just so happens that C.I. Scofield, who was a reasonably recent convert at the time and was converted under influences that were connected with John Darby and a Presbyterian pastor named Brooks, who I think was in Philadelphia, and some other forces, kind of shaped him early on. He had been a lawyer, but he became a Christian, and he was very taken with this notion that we're living in the end times. Very bright guy. And so he, over the course of several years, published a book, and the reference Bible, the Scofield Reference Bible, in which he took the position that in the end times, the church was going to be lukewarm. It's going to be going from bad to worse. It's going to be a time of slippage. We're going to be losing our orthodox moorings. Well, these people took a look at what was happening in the world. They thought, this is it. Look at this. The church is sliding off the edge here. And it gave a mentality of we're living in the end times. There's no reason to keep going out there and trying to change the world. That ain't going to happen. It's over.
Yeah.
The train is heading into the end time station. The best we can do is just try to salvage some souls as we can, before Jesus comes and the whole thing is over. I used to be in radio, and I remember J. Vernon McGee, who was a staunch dispensationalist, liked to use the phrase, "Why polish the brass on a sinking ship?" If you're on the ship Titanic, you don't spend time rearranging the deck chairs. There's more, and that was kind of his view. Politics, why go out and try to be involved in the long-term investment of time and money, because we know we're not going to be here that much longer. And so I think that kind of captured the evangelical imagination. It's the end times. We need to withdraw from political and other, involvements in the world, kind of have a fortress mentality and pray and sing hymns and wait for Jesus to come back and do some evangelism, but nothing that really speaks to the broader implementation of the wider effects of the gospel in the world. And so I think that unfortunately it sort of marginalized evangelical Christians just at a time when that kind of liberal influence was beginning to infiltrate the culture. And so it kind of sent us off in a bad direction. I think we still haven't really recovered from that as a culture, a Christian culture, as much as I'd like to think we could. But I think that's kind of where it happened. Early 20th century, those seem to be the forces that coalesce to send us off in that direction.
One bit of history I think that a lot of Christians aren't aware of is the break from Princeton Theological Seminary that J. Gresham Machen made back in the 1920s, I think it was.
Yes.
And, B.B. Warfield was the great theologian of Princeton Theological Seminary for many years, and one of the great theologians of world history. And by the way, like you did mention, guys like Riley and Schofield were actually, they had their positives. I mean, they did do some things that were quite helpful for the church. Ryrie, I mean, I'm glad I learned a lot. By the way, J. Vernon McGee, who was actually, a lot of people, because he had that country accent, a lot of people didn't realize that guy was one heck of a theologian.
Yeah, he was.
And I'm glad, because the Lord used him in my life to help with my brain. But yeah, I just ended up disagreeing with him on these things. But Machen was very concerned about the drift of the church into that modernist, skeptical approach to theology that really got its foothold, as you say, in continental Europe in the 19th century. But the break was not just the rise of Arminianism as the fundamental approach to soteriology, the study of salvation and so forth in the Bible, breaking from the Calvinist, Lutheran, Augustinian way of looking at this. So fine, it is orthodox. Arminianism is orthodox. I agree. There's great troubles with it in my mind, and I've pulled away from it. But that's become the dominant thinking. But Machen wasn't only concerned about that. He was concerned about the church breaking from its moorings of affecting the culture. I think, and you do a whole lot, which we're not going to talk much about now, and hopefully we can do a future broadcast to do so. You do a large series about American history, and how particularly the Presbyterian church, but really the church in general, had its influence in American culture. There was a time when the church believed that we must be deeply part of culture. And I think that what you're referring to really relates to that. And I'm concerned that these eschatological theories that have had prevalence in the church have totally thrown us away. I've been involved in politics since 1992, when Mike Pence introduced me to my first political job, and I've been fighting with people in the church, people who aren't in the church that care, and getting them involved in politics for some time. I think it's for want of good people being involved that we're seeing these breakdowns that we're having right now. What you're talking about is the core of that problem in my mind. Why is that such a threat? How is it that we got there beyond the fact that we allowed this eschatological thinking, this end times falsehood, to come into the American mind? beyond that, how have we got here? What do we need to do to get out of that? Maybe what should
Two different
Christians even
questions.
understand? Yeah, this is a good question.
You know, I think that there's a bit of an irony. I can't remember the whole cycle here. There was a fellow named Alexander Tyler. You know that name? And he was a historian. He lived about the time of the American Revolution, but he wrote a book which was analyzing history generally to his time. And he said most great civilizations go through a 200-year cycle in which they begin in slavery. Slavery produces courage. Courage produces noble deeds. I can't remember the whole thing, but anyway, the point is, after a while, you get prosperity. The prosperity tends to engender laziness, and the laziness tends to wind up going back into slavery. You know, and you can almost see that cycle in American history. We inherited a huge amount of the positive benefits of hardworking Puritan theology. And it developed a kind of work ethic in America that certainly is a good thing. And, you know, we think about American ingenuity and all of that. That's all kind of that Americana culture, which if a person's honest, you have to trace it back to that Puritan work ethic and so on. Well, the problem is that works well for the first, second generation. But by the third generation, people are getting pretty much accustomed to living the good life. They just take it for granted. You know, everything's always going to be good. We're fine. Everything's fine. It's prosperous. And when we lose track of the fact that these blessings are coming as a result of responsible obedience to God's way of doing life, when we lose sight of that, then we are opening the door to the dark forces of hellish spirits, you might say, you know, reaching into our culture. And we find out eventually, but usually too late, that nice order not to be taken for granted. It's like Ronald Reagan said, we're never more than one generation away from losing our freedoms. It's a constant vigilance that's required, especially of Christian people, to realize that we're always kind of right at the edge, and we have to keep our focus intact. And if we don't, we're likely to lose. I think what we've seen in the last few years in American culture is a testament to how desperately we need the gospel. Because when you eject the gospel from a culture, darkness comes in. People start throwing Molotov cocktails at others, and you see violence, gratuitous, horrible behavior. You would never expect it in the United States, and there it is happening. Shootings, all of this, and people are astonished, but they shouldn't be. The reason we haven't had it as much as we have lately is because we've had a more conspicuous presence of the gospel in the public square, and we've kind of lost it. So we're reaping the results of our negligence. I think even as Christians, we have to say we've been a little bit negligent in really doing the courageous thing and keeping the gospel out there, not just in church, but in the public square, not being embarrassed at the name of Jesus, and not being embarrassed to remind people of the ethic that he calls us to. And when we neglect all of that, we're going to reap a harvest.
Yeah, it seems that is our biggest problem right now. I am quite frustrated by the fact that Christians have refused to be a part of the answer. And they've sat by the side, and of course this dispensationalist approach to the end times is part of it. It's not everything, but it is part of it. They've sat off to the side and they're just waiting for it to all fall apart and saying, no, we're going to rush in and change it. One of the things that I talk about, and I want to get into some of the historical stuff that we talk about here, but one of the things that frustrates me about Christians' understanding of our constitutional system is they don't read the preamble. Yeah. I make note to people all the time the fact that we weren't created for this government. This government was created for us.
Right. That's right.
Okay. So how does the Constitution start? I mean, this is the Constitution, remember. This isn't just a Declaration of Independence, which is fantastic and fundamental, but is not a legal document. Okay. It was just a statement of breaking from Great Britain. But the Constitution, which does design the government, says we the people,
Right.
in order to form a more perfect union.
Yeah.
This has very real implications, even as it relates to Romans 13, which we'll I as well as talking about American history, I probably want to talk to you about Romans 13. Maybe we can talk a little bit about it now. But this misinterpretation of Romans 13, that we're just supposed to bow down in the middle of COVID and say, shut our churches down, tell us what we're supposed to do, government, I think is a bogus understanding of Romans 13. And more to the point, and this may or may not be true, I'm not a theologian, but if you ask me, we the people means we're the magistrates. That's what Romans 13 says, to go with the magistrate. Well, maybe we're the magistrates since we tell the government what to do. But even if we don't go that far, and I still think through that, the reality is the government is responsible to us. We are the sovereigns.
Yeah.
For good or for bad, we're the sovereigns according to the Constitution. And Christians in particular should reassert that. So when we see these politicians, Democrat or Republican, doing what they're doing, we should be looking at them. One other thing, having worked in Congress for 2 different congressmen for 8 years, knowing most of these people, you realize, especially when it comes to Romans 13 and that word magistrate, be subject to the magistrates. Well, no legislator is a magistrate. They just make the laws. The magistrate is the one that says what the laws are doing. And in my opinion, I tell people all the time, you deserve to give congressman or any other elected legislator no more respect than you would give any human being. And you should give them the respect of a human being, but you should never respect them in the way that Romans 13 is talking about. You should get in their faces and say, you're doing what's wrong. This is what the Constitution says. Do you agree with me in this assessment? Does this seem to kind of play into what you're saying in any way? I'm just curious.
Well, it's it's interesting that that was the most lively debate, I suppose, in the run up to the American Revolution. You had Christian people sharply divided in the colonies between those two schools of thought.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you had people who were saying, hey, the king is the king, read Romans 13. What part of that don't you get? He's the king. You're supposed to submit, and end of conversation. And then people like Sam Adams and a lot of others were saying, hold the phone. There are unalienable rights. God has created us. And though we, and it's very much to your point, we, the people, create government as a matter of convenience for us. We all come into this world, in what's the so-called state of nature. We all come into this world equal, where nobody is born automatically with some sort of superior status. They may claim it. Somebody may claim to be an aristocrat or a nobleman, but the fact is, before God, we all come into this world with equal dignity, equal freedom, and then I say, well, as a matter of convenience, in order to make sure I can enjoy my freedom, let's, we the people, create an apparatus which has the responsibility to guard this, which are inalienable rights from God, to secure those rights so that I can enjoy them without stressing out night and day, or constantly having to preoccupy myself with defending myself. Let's have a police force, or let's have whatever. And so the legitimacy of government depends pretty heavily on a recognition that government is here for me, not I'm here for it. And I do think Romans 13 has been read somewhat extravagantly to argue that we are more on the line of subjects than those who have been brought into this world by God, and we have a reciprocal duty to the government to support it, but only so far as it doesn't start trampling on God-given rights, and at that point they become illegitimate. Yeah. So it's not an easy needle to thread, but at the same time, in principle, I think there's been a pretty significant misunderstanding of what Romans 13 is calling us to do.
And there have been interpretations. I have group of friends. One of them is a professor at Indiana University, a tenured professor there, goes to my church. And then another one is a friend of mine who's run for political office as a libertarian many times, by the way, here in Indiana. We were talking recently about that interpretation, and the professor friend says to me, he had heard something. What did I think? I've heard very strained, extravagant interpretations of Romans 13 where we just roll over everybody. I think that there's a serious matter there. By the way, it sounds like you and I are a little closer in our interpretation. R.C. Sproul was somewhat restrictive in his interpretation of Romans 13. And I think that's an important, by the way, perspective to hear. And God forbid, I don't know how to, go against R.C. Sproul, who was one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. He never said it, but he was.
Right.
But nonetheless, I think you can go way off the deep end in your interpretation as well, too. But my basic problem, and we're going to get there, by the way, because there's so much in history that you have talked about. We want to talk about your book, and we're going to get into some Old Testament connections into your book as well, too. But as we're rolling there briefly, so one of my problems, though, with this strict interpretation of Romans 13 is that until 2018, when I left Congress, I knew very well, or was acquainted with, every congressman who claimed to be a Christian, Protestant or Catholic too, by the way. And I worked for one who was a Catholic, who's a dear friend of mine still to this day. But here's what I noticed. About 80% of them, I say, vote like Satan. Now, I hate to be so harsh, but I'm going to explain why. Because they're all antinomians. Why do I say that? Because none of them, and antinomianism is against law. That's goes into the Greek root words. The concept of antinomianism is against law, whereas law is not fundamental. When you get into Old Testament scripture, you recognize how serious God is about law, in his holiness and his demand of righteousness of Israel in particular at that time. Now, if someone is a Christian and really believes in the Bible, then they should recognize how serious God is about truth, about righteousness, and about law. And we've got that Constitution sitting out there, and we spend 70 to 80% of our money in our federal budget outside Article 1, Section 8 restrictions. That's a long discussion. But nonetheless, that Christians, and by the way, there are political realities to how we got as far as we are and how you draw that back. You can't, bite off the elephant in one chew. I grant that. But nonetheless, you should be darn serious about it. And most of them aren't. They just go along with what leadership tells them. And, we're just trying to, whatever. They don't even think about the Constitution. I worked for Thomas Massey from Kentucky. He's getting a lot of heat recently for voting for this debt ceiling deal here in 2023, and then not voting for the first Adam Schiff censure. Okay. Now, by the way, I'd have voted just the opposite of him on both of those. And I love Thomas, and he's a good guy. But one of the things is, even in that disagreement, everyone wants to throw him off the deep end now. But I tell people all the time, listen, all those people that voted the way you liked, most of them don't read the Constitution at all, much less every day like Thomas does. This is what I'm getting at in antinomianism. If you're not serious about the law that's in front of you, how can you say you're even serious about God's law if you claim Christ? This is a serious issue. Christians can really have a massive influence on culture if they're willing to assert it, it seems to me.
Yeah. And the fact is, there are enough Christians in this culture that it could virtually be transformed overnight.
Right.
When you think about the disproportionate influence that, say, woke culture is having, you think, if hell can exercise that much influence, then how much more could the rule of Christ exercise influence? if God's people just stepped up and had the courage to stand out in the public square and speak the truth of Christ. But it's tough to do. It can be very expensive to do. I think we've seen enough well-planned strategic arrests and abuses of people in the last few years to know that it is not exactly a Sunday school picnic. If you're going to go out there and be a courageous Christian, there's a price tag attached to that sometimes that can be pretty significant. So I can appreciate why people are less than enthusiastic about that. But there's a lot at stake. I've was very impressed studying more closely the founding era, and these people, they weren't all card-carrying Puritans or Calvinists in the narrow sense, but they were all heirs of a certain heritage that came especially out of the Reformed wing of the Protestant Reformation, and that was the culture of the day. And it did engender a fair amount of hostility to government abuse, and that was really the birth pangs of this nation, and we've wandered a ways away from that, and I think very much at our peril. I don't know if we're going to get it back or not. Who knows? But I hope that we'll see. And another, one of the things that I did a short series, you mentioned it, called Presbyterians in the American Revolution. Not really distinctly focused on the Presbyterians, but I happen to be one, so I just use that as a convenient title. But one of the most powerful influences, of course, running up to the Revolution, was the preaching of George Whitefield, who was himself an Anglican, but an astonishing evangelist, and he really galvanized a sort of self-image in the colonies of something very different from simply 13 disparate colonies over here. And so I'll tell you, I pray every day for God to raise up another George Whitefield. I mean, somebody that's bigger than life, somebody that speaks, words of courage to power and forces a hearing. It takes a spiritual revolution before you get a political revolution, if it's going to be any kind of proper revolution. And so I think that's where we need to really focus our efforts to be courageous in proclaiming the word of Christ and praying for voices that are bigger than life. I don't know anybody out there right now. I know some courageous preachers. I pray for them. I want them to keep on, but somebody that kind of rises way above the landscape and becomes a dominant force in the culture. I think we're ripe for that. I hope God has it in his plan to bring something like that along one of these days.
Well, Whitefield and Edwards both, by the way. And I've said for some time here, and our prayers are quite similar, but I've been praying for a third great awakening for a couple decades now. You see by the way, we should be deeply involved in politics. Christians should.
Absolutely.
If they are not, and I'm not saying they have to be as deeply involved as I have been, by the way, I get that. Not everybody can do that. I always tell people I'm doing this so you don't have to, but nonetheless, they should be involved. And but we can't. You can do that, and we should do that. But along the way, we need a third great awakening. Like, I'm not certain that we have much hope. By the way, will a third great awakening mean everybody's going to turn to Christ in the culture? No, it doesn't. But what it will mean primarily is a transformation of Christians and the church. One, that will be so profound that two, it influences the culture deeply. Right. We need that right now more than anything, because actually I'm certain that most Americans feel captured. They feel bound up by this woke movement that denies basic science as it relates to sexuality, that denies basic understandings of economics, of thrift, of doing things the right way, of choosing well with scarce resources. And the American Revolution was an early example of how we had to do that. Now I'm wanting to, though, on that basis, to try to, first of all, to transition to Old Testament stuff that I want to talk to you about, but to try to give some perspective for Christians. How does this challenge, especially in light of Romans 13, relate to what Christians went through when they had no dominance in Roman culture at the birth of the church? Do you have any perspectives on that? Any thoughts? Maybe just talk about that history just briefly, but how you think it might even relate.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's you made a comment a couple of minutes ago about COVID, and there's a connection here. So, but I know there were some churches that courageously said, okay, government, you can say what you want. We're going to keep meeting. We're going to keep singing. We're going to keep praising. And because you happen to be trampling on space here that happens to belong to King Jesus. He's the sovereign here, not you. There's a sharp distinction between King Jesus and his crown rights and what the governor of a given state might tell us to do. And if we have to choose between the two, then we need to choose appropriately. Well, a lot of churches weren't prepared to go there. They, once the government gave its so-called guidelines, then it required in their minds that we all kind of lay down and play dead and forget that Jesus calls us to something different and something better. Well, in the first century, I think Christians had a much more clear-eyed understanding of what Jesus had just established. He had established a kingdom. When he said, repent, for the kingdom of God is rolling into the station, friends. It's arriving. Here it is. That wasn't just poetry. He wasn't talking about something, millennia in the future. This was his establishing of his kingdom, which had been predicted through the Old Testament. And they had a pretty good idea that means you obey Christ. And as he establishes his church, that church is certainly going to be deferential to government, but not going to be obedient at any point that lets government trench upon the sovereign rights of Jesus. Well, it didn't take long for Rome to figure out that represented a threat,
Right.
Interestingly, at the beginning, it was more the Jewish threat that was giving problems to the Christian movement. But by the time Nero came along, the focus had changed. I don't think Nero was attacking the church because he saw in it a great threat to his rule, but he was looking for a scapegoat, because of a fire, all of that. You're probably familiar with that. But nevertheless, it kind of opened the door to more of a hostile relationship there. And the sporadic persecutions that tended to take place from then on in the Roman world were largely driven by concern with this growing movement that was giving its allegiance to some authority besides Rome. They didn't mind if you had your private deity. Okay, fine, but if you're going to start giving ultimate allegiance to something besides Rome, Houston, we have a problem, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what began to hit the psyche of people like Marcus Aurelius and Antoninus Pius and some of these mid-second century Roman rulers who were really viewing the Christian movement, oddly, as a political threat, not just a religious dissent, but an actual political threat to their well-being. Well, it was a political threat. And in spite of their attempts to stamp it out, the Christian movement kept growing, insinuating itself into every level of Christian society, so that finally Rome caved. In the early 4th century, Constantine comes along and says, okay, uncle, you win,
Well, by the way, he said uncle to King Jesus, apparently, or at least so we believe.
That's right.
But also, they were inserting themselves into the political culture in various parts of the Roman Empire, even through Marcus Aurelius and Antoninus Pius's administration of Rome. I mean, which is interesting. They started injecting themselves in a serious way, respectful but serious, not backing down, seeing opposition. So how does that relate to what the Christian ought to be thinking about today? Because I'm convinced there aren't too many Christians like me that are willing to wade into that debate and be attacked. I mean, one of these days you could do some searches on me, Bruce, and you'll see how much I get attacked in the media, particularly in Colorado, where I was. But that kind of willingness to work through that is not prevalent in my mind in Christian culture right now.
Yeah, no, it isn't. And I tell you, I don't have an easy answer. I mean, you're doing what you can. I do what I can. You have to work with what you got. I've got certain gifts. You've got certain gifts. Every Christian has a gift set. And you have to ask Jesus, okay, how can I use the resources you've entrusted to me to make a difference, not just in my home, my family, whatever, but in this world that you've planted me in right now. And it's going to be a different answer for every person that comes along.
Yeah.
But there's certainly a place for Christian people to be prepared to say foul ball. It's like, God invests authority in the people, and we, the people, create government, and to insist that the government that we've created provide answers to us for its conduct. That's just part and parcel of what it is to be a decent citizen. If we do anything less than that, then we're really falling short of our fiduciary obligation as as citizens of a country. The difficulty is we've been negligent for so long, Jeff, that there's a huge amount of power that's become concentrated in a relatively small number of people. We are living in a true oligarchy right now, with a little bit of democratic window dressing. Mm-hmm. So we like to think that we kind of control the levers of government, but we really don't. You've got trillions of dollars backing up a few people who believe they've kind of confused themselves with God and think that they can make up life the way it's supposed to be. Well, that's tough. I mean, but I'm not underestimating what Jesus can do. The kings of the world take their stand against the Lord and against his anointed, but the one who sits in heaven scoffs. Well, in some ways, we Christians need to join him in scoffing a bit, but not walk away from the fight, go out there and wage the battle. And, fortunately, happily, there's a lot of good, news sources, that kind of thing, that are out there that are beating the drum for a much more credible understanding of what's happening in the world. We should support them. We should, do whatever we can to all the voices, conservative talk radio, all of these are ways to try to have an influence. But what any given person can do really probably varies with every person you talk to. I wish I had a better answer for you. You think about, we're not far from where Nazi Germany was in the 30s. People just couldn't believe things were going to be so bad. And somebody like a maniac like Hitler can come along and just keep pushing the buttons until finally people wake up one day and ask, where did our country go? And I'm afraid we're sort of moving in that direction. And I hope we have some courageous voices that'll at least be a big impediment to that.
Well, progress. And also this isn't the first iteration of this problem. So a lot of people forget the fact that, going back to that same time period you just referred to, Mussolini was praised and lauded here in the United States. And he really is the founder of that fascist principle, which, by the way, is not a right-wing ideology at all. It is, it is in the sense that it's corporate. Yeah, it is in the sense that it's corporatist, and it uses corporations to get its job done, but it's a socialist ideology. But,
I read interrupt you there for a second, Jeff, but I read a great book you're probably familiar with by Dinesh D'Souza, entitled The Big Lie. I don't know if you ever came across that, but the whole book devoted to the proposition that Hitler, who's often called a right-wing extremist, was actually a left-wing extremist. And that's the way he was viewed originally. And the big lie was to convert him into this so-called right-wing, guy, which he certainly wasn't. He was a totalitarian. He was a statist. He was everything that true conservatism wouldn't be. But anyway,
National Socialist.
The same way.
The Nazi Party was the National Socialist Party.
Socialist, that's right.
And we forget that quite often. Mussolini, though, I think in many ways, as bad as Hitler was, and certainly on the back end of it, he's the one that had the most influence. Mussolini preached this fascist gospel, so to speak, which was bad news, for a long time to the West, and they listened to him. And it was really, really bad. And similar to these days, he utilized government power and physical force of violence to subdue his opponents. And there's so many similarities to that right now. That's why I've been talking, as we get ready to transition here to some Old Testament stuff. That's why I've been taught that this whole against nice concept that I do in my podcast is kind of based on Micah 6:8. He's shown you, oh man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God.
Amen.
And by the way, that's the Hebrew word chesed, loving kindness there in terms of kindness. But like I tell people all the time, we have no command scripturally to be nice at all. None.
Right.
There's no command to be nice. There is a command to be kind.
Yeah.
But let's kind of flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
kindness looks like what we typically call niceness, but it also looks like this. When your child is doing something wrong,
Exactly.
it would be unkind not to discipline them, and no child being disciplined thinks it's very nice. Right.
Yeah.
So it requires harsh, sometimes pushback to untruths in society, and Christians should be doing that. That's the whole foundation of what I am trying to do. And it takes knowledge. So that's why I want to get your knowledge here, because we need that background knowledge to understand the foundations of all this, to understand church history, to understand history in general, and what are the implications of that. Without that understanding, we can't knowledgeably take on society. And it's fundamentally necessary to do that. We have a wealth of information, historically and otherwise, in scripture, to understand how to navigate all this. We have great examples of people who went through challenging, difficult circumstances and yet honored God in the process and moved society forward. Right. So I'm curious from you, just to transition to this. I mean, why do we want to know? And you were challenged by this because you were teaching kids who asked a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Why do we want to know how history connects to biblical history? Before we talk about the challenges of even seeing how history can connect. By being honest,
I think there's several good answers to that. One is just we're called to be students of the scripture. And while I know some people maintain an idea that, the Bible is all sufficient, that's all I need to read, it's all I need to study, and never get outside the four corners of what's in the Bible, that's fine. But at the same time, the light that is shed on even casual Bible reading by having some concept of what's happening in the world, it's just it is, I think it's transformative, and so that we can begin to see that what's happening in the scripture is happening in a context in which decisions that people are making are obviously being informed not only by the rule of God, but also by the challenges of the moment. When Hezekiah is being challenged by Sennacherib, for example, just this is not Aesop's fables. This is a guy who's facing a true threat to his well-being. He's the ruler, and he's trying to do the right thing. Well, when we look at him and say, okay, what did the right thing look like in that context? What did it mean when he had those political forces arrayed against him? It helps us appreciate how we can take the same principles and say, okay, what do I do now, in my given situation? So it was partly that. I think just knowing something of what's happening in the ancient world that's outside the narrative of the Old Testament itself is a great faith builder. I think, we could read the Bible and realize, this really did happen. I mean, these are reflections among the people of God of real evident threats from outside that they were taking seriously. And it helps us understand what faith looks like. But I think, more maybe to the interest of your question, the Old Testament does have a political philosophy. And a lot of times people read the Old Testament and they kind of read right past it because they're not looking for that. They're looking for devotional information, or they're looking for, something else, but they're not looking for a political philosophy. But if you read the books of Moses, and if you're looking for it, and you read what exactly is he implementing here, you begin to see that there is political apparatus at work, and it's deeper than one particular form of government. It's there even in a monarchy. It's there in a kind of Republican approach with elders. It's there even in a kind of democratic situation. In other words, these are undergirding principles that are not simply the superstructure of a form of government as such, but they are there that support any form of government and give, you would say, proper rules by which it should be operating. And, you know, these are things like that the people are viewed as the source of authority, even with the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 19, the people are asked to voluntarily embrace in a covenantal way this set of rules that's being given by God. God doesn't come down and send a bunch of lightning bolts around and say, okay,
Right.
now you got to admit. He doesn't do that. He
Right.
looks for their voluntary submission, which attaches a whole lot of weight and dignity to the human participation in this. You know, the idea that there's accountability. When Samuel was just about to retire and hand the reins over to King Saul, he makes this amazing speech. He gets up in front of all the people and says, okay, look, did I steal anybody's donkey? Did I take a bribe? Did I pervert justice? Did I do this? Call me on the carpet right now. I'll make it right. You know, this is what every politician should do. Instead of constantly running around covering their bases, how come we don't have a politician get up and ask that question with a straight face? Okay, where have I wronged you? You know, and that idea that people hold politicians accountable because they are our servants is kind of taken for granted, you know, in the biblical narrative. The idea that regardless of the form of government, there were elders. Mm-hmm. And these were people who were chosen by the people. These weren't imposed. They weren't, you know, appointed by some kind of, you know, puppet master behind some curtain somewhere. These were people elected based on fair, honest elections, and they were elected because they were seen to be the most credible, mature, wise people available. So they're put into these positions of leadership. These are all
subject to dismissal, even.
Yeah, exactly. So the idea that we actually, like you were saying earlier, control the reins. These people are working for us. We're paying their salary, and it's perfectly legitimate to insist on that kind of accountability. And there's other things. I mean, those are just coming to mind, you know, but the sort of underpinnings of a political philosophy. There's nothing in the Old Testament view of government which warrants what you'd call an autocratic government or a totalitarian government. Nothing of that is there. In fact, it's virtually unprecedented in the ancient world, say 1500 BC, that you'd have any civilization in the world that had something other than a caste system, something other than an oligarchy or an absolute monarchy. And Moses comes along and says, no, fundamentally, we're all equal. You know, even the preamble to the Ten Commandments addresses people in the singular. I am the Lord thy God, singular. Yeah. Your God, not either the body politic as one person or each individual as one person. Either way, it comes out the same. You are the people that are now vested with this authority. And you know, so it seems to me that if we read the Bible asking those kind of questions, we learn a lot about how government should be done. And really, in many ways, you go back to, you know, people like Blackstone or even John Locke, any of these kind of the philosophers of the day back in, you know, the early days of our colonies. This was the conversation that was going on. I mean, this was the question that was being asked by people: how we're going to create a government? Well, what should it look like? And there was a lot of inquiry into the biblical philosophy that fed right in. Even, you know, you were mentioning the Declaration. The Declaration, you're right, is not law. It is philosophy, and it is, in fact, the official declaration of the political philosophy upon which our Constitution would be real. As a lawyer, I like to call the Declaration of Independence our Articles of Incorporation. You know, you start a corporation, you'll have articles filed with the Secretary of State, and it sets forth the fundamental principles, the philosophy by which you're going to run your company. Yeah. And then out of that come bylaws. Well, we have articles of incorporation, the Declaration. It acknowledges God in heaven, acknowledges all men are created equal, acknowledges inalienable rights. I mean, all of that. And then we have a Constitution, which is like our bylaws. Okay, given that philosophy, how are we going to make it happen in a practical way? And I think, we need to dust that off and take another look and appreciate the genius of what created this country in the first place.
Yeah, no, I agree. And by the way, before we're going to transition here into some specific examples of some historical things that you've studied, and I'm just going to. By the way, what's the name of the book that you wrote on history?
Well, it's a catchy title. It's called Historical and Chronological Context of the Bible. So,
Yeah,
but I shortened it to just historical context of the Bible. I tried to come up with something a little juicier, but that's finally what we wanted.
Well, listen, everyone should go to your website, brucegore.com, BRUCEGORE.com, and to YouTube, because they want to hear your lectures on that. And yes, they're lectures, and I get it. Folks, you'll be fascinated because you probably have never even thought about all this stuff before, and you need to, and you'll be amazed at how you see the Bible connecting. And by the way, you're very honest about times when you're speculating, when you're arguing from where we don't know for certain, but it seems to line up, all the way to, no, this is a specific reference that specifically connects there. But so back to political philosophy in the Old Testament, what I tell people, and I am willing to call myself a Christian libertarian, not because I like the Libertarian Party. In fact, I say the Libertarian Party basically runs in the manner that their philosophy is, if we can make prostitution and drugs legal, we'll all be free. I mean, that's kind of how the Libertarian Party often acts.
Right.
Although there are good people there in that organization, and I know them, but there are many of them that have that idea. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about freedom, the ability for every person to make their choices and to reap all the good benefits of good choices, and also to reap all the negative benefits of their bad choices, because that's how you balance out. People will be more cautious and not do stupid stuff when they might pay for it. Yeah, that's right. But they should. But we don't have any envy for someone that's wealthy. Abraham was probably the wealthiest person of his day. There's no reason to envy him, because he was also a godly man, imperfect, but godly. So anyway, with that background, I have told people really very clearly, and I think this feeds off what you're saying, God's ideal form of government is such that every individual is responsible directly to him for their actions, and that there is something of a judicial system, for want of a better word, that can allow disputes to be adjudicated and resolved. And that's exactly what existed from the time of Moses through Joshua on through the Judges, even with all the imperfections of Israel that you saw through Judges, including one period where there was a person who was a king. But nonetheless, that was his plan. And then by the time we get to 1 Samuel 8, God is rebuking Israel for wanting a king. And he told them specifically what was going to be the problem with that. And Samuel, according to God's direction, laid that out very clearly in 1 Samuel 8. And those are all things that we're struggling with in our government even to this day. Does that seem fair and an accurate description?
Yeah, 1 Samuel 8 has been a bit of a ticklish chapter in some people's minds, because it looks like, these people are rejecting me, and you get a very mixed review of the whole idea of having a king. And of course, the critical language there is, we want a king like the other nations. That's what they're demanding. And that's really the crux of the problem. It's not an objection to the king as such, because in fact, the Old Testament, even Moses contemplates there be a king. Deuteronomy 17, he sets down a set of rules applicable to the king. He knew there'd be a king eventually. That wasn't the issue. The issue was, what kind of king is he going to be? And the people seem to have wanted a king that looked more like kind of an absolute monarch. Louis XIV, that's what he liked to call himself. I am the state. That's what he wanted to say. I am, whatever I say is law because I say it. I'm above the law. I am the law. That's one kind of king. The Bible never endorses that. In fact, that is seen as a great evil and something to be rejected. But and so that seems to be what they were asking for, because every king of every other nation was precisely that kind of king. The Pharaoh in Egypt combined religious, political authority. The Assyrian kings, about all of them. It's not until you get to the Persians that you have it, and that's much later, that you have anything looking like a king with somewhat limited powers. Moses is the first one that actually gens up a philosophy of what you'd call a constitutional monarchy, in which the king is a job, and the job involves a certain degree of authority, but the authority is balanced by some very significant restrictions. So I heard R.C. Sproul say once, maybe you heard this too. He said that in ancient Israel, probably the least free person in Israel was the king, because he was responsible not only to keep all the other laws, but he had a very special set of rules that even tied him up more, that he had even greater restrictions than another person might have. And that was a way of clipping the wings of the monarch so that they didn't spin out of control. And you have to say, if you look at Moses and what he was developing in 1500 BC or thereabouts and compare it, there's nothing even like it, even remotely like it. His system of due process in the judicial order was unlike anything. The whole notion of due process was kind of invented by Moses. Hammurabi is 200 years earlier. He decided whether you were guilty or innocent by picking you up and throwing you in the river. And if an alligator ate you, you were guilty. And if you made it to the shore, then you were innocent. And Moses said, I think there's a better way to do due process here than that. So I just think, if we ask the question, what is this really rich treasure of biblical truth giving us? It's a pretty advanced and pretty remarkable system of how we should be doing, this kind of governmental thing.
Sorry about that. And to cap that, you would say it is a form of limited government. I mean, that is roughly what God wants. However we come to that. That was what was seen there. And government officials being totally subject to the people and not the other way around. And to God ultimately, but I mean through the people. Yeah. Well, so now you talked about, so this is a good transition. You just gave one, because you have a fascinating discussion in your YouTube videos, and you have your videos on your website as well too, brucegore.com. The differences between the Code of Hammurabi and the code of the law given through Moses. Right. Why don't you may not be able to go in deep detail there, but why don't you talk about what some of those differences are? Because that's where people get really confused. They think, he copied off of Hammurabi. And I mean, maybe there's some things that are similar enough, but he claims that it was given to him by God. So what are the differences between those two codes of law?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hammurabi is usually credited as being the most advanced lawgiver, you would say, of the ancient world up to his time. And he lived in around 1700 BC, so about 200 years before Moses, Babylonian. And he is really the ruler over what was the old Babylonian Empire. There's two Babylonian eras: Neo-Babylon, which was Nebuchadnezzar, 1,000 years later, and then Hammurabi, really the main name associated with the early Babylonians. Well, he had a code that was, I think it's 282 rules, you might say, provisions of Hammurabi's code. Some of them are quite good. Like I said, his due process procedures probably could stand a fair amount of renovating, but in terms of the actual rules, not bad, and so you have principles against stealing and lying and, that sort of thing, and as you might expect. And so we want to give credit where credit is due. The most famous thing that he says that shows up in Moses is called the lex talionis, which is the rule of the eye. And popularly, it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Hammurabi seems to have intended that be enforced as stated. In other words, if you poked out somebody's eye, the same thing would be done to you in a reciprocal process. And maybe it was that way or not, although he doesn't have any specific provisions to that effect. His way of enforcing his rules in terms of punishments seems to have been a little different. But anyway, the rule is there, and so that's been one common tie between them. The big difference between Hammurabi and Moses is, one, Hammurabi's preamble to his code spends all its time talking about how great Hammurabi is. And that's why people should trust him, because he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, And so the God almost takes back seat to the importance of Hammurabi. You read the preamble to Moses' code, Exodus 19, it's just the opposite. Moses is basically just a servant, and this whole thing is understood as being traced to God. He is the great source and honor behind this. The second big difference is that Hammurabi's code is virtually all of it what's called casuistic code, which means it's structured along the if-then sort of arrangement. If ABC happens, then CEF must follow, that kind of thing, where you have an if-then kind of arrangement. And then you're supposed to kind of triangulate off of those individual rules to apply it in other situations that may come along later. Moses gives what's called apodictic code, and he's really the first one to do it quite this way, and we call it the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments is not stated as if-then. It's not if this happens, then this will follow. It's stated as pronouncements. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not perjure yourself. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt, and so on. And some thou shalts. You shall honor your father and your mother, and so on. Well, those are powerful, self-sustaining, independent propositions of, you might say, legal and ethical truth. Don't lie. All right. Don't kill. Okay. Are there exceptions? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact. And so for Moses, the apodictic law is the rule that is fixed, eternal, unchanging. And then casuistic law, the if-then, comes to construe, to apply the apodictic. So, if I'm in a war situation, then I may in fact kill. I'm not breaking the rule, because in fact there are circumstances here that warrant what would otherwise not usually be permissible. Kill means to illegitimately kill, that idea. And so you have a fairly sophisticated balance between two different kinds of law in Moses that you really don't have in other systems. In popular current culture, we would say apodictic law is statutory law. A legislator meets, a legislature gathers, they pass a law, it's signed off by the governor or the president. Normally it's apodictic. You will do this. It gives a guidance of some kind. More than guidance, it gives a rule. But then you have cases that come out of the courts, which are supposed to take that rule and say, okay, here's how it applies in this situation or that situation. And so the greatest casuistic body in our country is the Supreme Court. But all through the country, we, of course, have courts that are charged with doing that. So you would say there's some similarity between them, certainly. But with Moses, there's a very significant leap forward in the sophistication of how the whole legal and political system operates that was not found in Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a step in the right direction. He should be appreciated. He was a good guy, but nevertheless, he didn't quite get to the advanced level that you find in Moses.
Well, and it was a fundamental change. I'm curious, how do we know, based upon your studies, that Moses existed, and how does he connect into history of his time? What are some of the most interesting things that show us where Moses' impact was? And by the way, before I get to that, like a whole lot archaeologically that we know about the Old Testament did not start to emerge until the
Mhm.
18th and 19th century.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Well, as far as I know, that's right. I'm not an
Yeah.
archaeologist, so I'm not going to
Yeah.
get up my depth here, more than necessary. But I think you'd say in the 1800s, 19th century, there were some huge discoveries. Austin Henry Layard was an Englishman, kind of he was like, I like to call him the 19th century version of Indiana Jones. He was out there, kind of an adventurer. He discovered a ton of stuff in Iraq and in those regions that just were, very important.
He was
But
initially looking for Nineveh, right? That was
yeah,
his
that's
original
what got him out there originally, and he found Ashurbanipal's Paul's library and other things. He was quite a guy. He had a lot of adventures. Somebody should make a movie about his life sometime.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the question of whether Moses existed, the fact is, except for some rather subtle evidence, we don't have any evidence that Moses existed outside the Bible. As simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
But the evidence of the Bible has to cause everybody to take pause. There was obviously somebody along the way who was an astonishing innovator. And while some people want to say, well, it was all, 500 BC and it was all late reconstruction of this or that, and critical scholars love to try to poke holes. The fact is, the testimony of history and even the testimony of archaeology is that there was a quite advanced civilization in Palestine, what's now called Palestine in Israel, or Canaan, that certainly predates, these later hypothetical dates for all of this. And you have to say something happened. Like somebody said once, you look at the Grand Canyon, something happened here. Something, and you look at the Bible and you realize that this smacks of more than just a couple of inventive people putting together a system of how to run a government or how to run a court or something like that. I wouldn't say it's ironclad proof, but I think the evidence certainly weighs heavily in favor of the fact that there was an extraordinary intervention in human history that happened sometime along the way back in that era. There certainly was a Jewish population or a Hebrew population in Egypt. That's been verified. There was a Hebrew population in Canaan at a later time. That's been verified. And that there's enough known about it to say, there's more here than simply just some nomadic Bedouins who kind of migrated around and put up a couple of tents and called it a civilization. There's more to be said for it than that. So, I at some point you say maybe archaeology is going to give us definitive proof of some of this eventually, but for anybody that has a certain degree of balanced sympathy with the biblical testimony, you don't have to work too hard to believe.
And I'm curious your thoughts here, because it's also a difference in historical transmission. So most of the historical evidence and transmission of history that we have, as you point out rightly in your lectures, prior to Herodotus, which is the father of history, was real. It's not that it's not inaccurate or unuseful, but it certainly leaves out anything negative.
That's right.
And it enhances the positives. And it's usually transmitted through the for the benefit of and through the instruction of the king or leader that was involved. Whereas biblical transmission of truth, and one of the things I was listening to one of your lectures recently about Nebuchadnezzar, like the only place that we hear about Nebuchadnezzar having that 7 years off is Silence. In scripture. But we also have, as you mentioned, it is, we got to be careful with it, but it is an argument from silence, but we also don't hear anything for 7 years from Nebuchadnezzar. And so, and Nebuchadnezzar or anyone wasn't going to, or maybe he had, and after he died, no one wanted to transmit that because they appreciated him. So that whatever he might have said, someone destroyed. But the point being that it is interesting that the Old Testament survives. And I don't agree. I mean, we can have a lot of debates over when the actual writings first showed up and all these this was in 500 BC and they reconstructed blah, 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 blah. Okay. That's a long discussion and it's an important one, but it's a long and sometimes precarious one. But the fact is it did transmit that way. And with that kind of information, and it was not a culture, and I think we have maybe historical indications of this, but it was not a culture that was trying to applaud itself. No. It was a culture, negative as it could have been, that felt itself submitted to God. Am I misrepresenting that?
No, you're exactly right, and it is in fact another anomaly, you could say, of ancient Hebrew writings, regardless of when it was written. I don't know. You know the name Vishal Mangalwadi? Do you know that name?
Yeah. Yes.
He's probably the leading Christian intellectual, in India. Grew up in a Hindu background. I think he went to Oxford and came to faith at some point along the way. He's written a lot of great books. I'd recommend anything he's ever written is worth reading, but probably the flagship work of his is called The Book That Made Your World. And he writes as someone from the East, from India, assessing Western civilization and pointing out that it's a pretty easy case to make that what created Western civilization, which at least used to be viewed as a wonderful advanced expression of human achievements, was the Bible. It was the Bible that made the world. But what Vishal Mangalwadi says is the first time, before he was even converted, he was just interested because he was becoming more and more aware of this Christian thing, and he realized to be a well-educated guy, he should have some idea what it was. So he just sat down and read the Bible, great idea. And he said the first time he just sat down, started reading it, took, a month or so, read through the whole Bible. He said the thing that astonished him was he had never read a book that was so anti-Semitic as the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures. He said, you read the Assyrians, you read the Persians, you read the Egyptians, you read the Babylonians, you read all these guys. All they do is talk about how wonderful they are. And the Assyrians will talk, these guys, the splendor of my might, reduce them to kind of slavish obeisance before me, all of this. You read the Hebrew scriptures, they are so brutally honest and critical of even their most esteemed champions. Even David has his Bathsheba. All of these people, if they got a black eye, boy, it's reported and you think, who does that? Who would do that? I mean, it's another argument really for the fact that this is a unique book. This is not just another piece of propaganda coming down the pike like all these others. It may be accurate, but it's still propaganda because it's highly selective accuracy. Correct. And if anything, the Old Testament is selective in the opposite direction. It makes sure we don't miss any point where there was a screw up back there because the glory had to go to God. The whole point was to say, these people, it was not their righteousness, not their brilliance, not their genius. It was God that carried them along in his mercy. And that's the message. And who makes that up? What humanistic, speculative spirit comes along and says, we're a bunch of losers and it's only God that that's not the standard agenda that you read in ancient writings at all.
Well, and by the way, one of the claims that's out there, if anyone goes on YouTube and you'll see certain videos talking about, Israel was really not a monotheistic culture that happened later, blah, blah, blah. And I sit back and say, these are people who have studied the archaeology and they say the archaeology shows that. And I laugh at that because I say, that's really funny because you read the Old Testament and these people were constantly running off into multi-theistic paths constantly. So the archaeology actually proves what the Old Testament is saying related to monotheism and not the other way around. That was the standard was monotheism that they were breaking constantly.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point. Absolutely.
Well, so okay, so and I appreciate you taking time with me, and I want to get some other trinkets. So everyone should go to brucegore.com, and look for him on YouTube, because you want to learn a lot about the historical perspective of the Bible. It will enlighten you. It will help you figure out things that you had never thought of before. And it's not going to change your view of scripture, of God's providence. It's just going to enhance it all. And that is very, very much worth that. I want to ask you a few questions then about some other areas that I've listened to you talk about,
Okay.
that I think could be really enlightening. I want to hit on right now Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus the Great. Now, so those are two different things, although
Right.
very close historically to
Yes.
one another. But let's talk about Nebuchadnezzar. I touched on it earlier. Tell some really interesting historical facts about Nebuchadnezzar that the average person reading scripture might not know about, but were all incredibly significant to what they're reading.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty broad question there, so I'm not quite
Pick
sure
the best ones.
if
Yeah, of
you're
course
fishing
it is. Yeah.
for
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
You know, Nebuchadnezzar is usually remembered as the greatest king. His father was Nebuchadnezzar, who was kind of the self-made. He created, you might say, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And Nebuchadnezzar inherited that. But there are some, he, for example, wound up in a city called Carchemish, which would be in kind of North Syria, still exists to this, roughly the same name. And he was chasing the Assyrians. So his first claim to fame was, as the Assyrian empire was falling, he wasn't the king yet, he was a crown prince, but he was the commander of the armies that chased the skeleton Assyrian army off to Carchemish. And actually the Egyptians came up. Necho was the Egyptian pharaoh to rescue the Assyrians, because apparently they had cooked up some deal. That's when King Josiah of Judah was killed in the field of Megiddo. So Nebuchadnezzar had his tail whipped by the Egyptians early on, and he had to retreat. And it looked like he wasn't going to amount to much. Well, he came back a few years later as a ruler on steroids, and so he came sweeping through and not only defeated the Egyptians, but just swept through the whole region, including Canaan, including Jerusalem, including all of that region, and wound up taking people back to Babylon, including Daniel, as the biblical narrative tells it, and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, under the Babylonian names. And so you think, well, Nebuchadnezzar certainly is a known quantity in ancient history. We have his annals, we have his writings, we have all the good stuff. We don't have any of the bad stuff, but we know enough to know that there was really this guy. He's responsible for what's called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Nobody knows what they look like, but I imagine they were beautiful. He married a Median princess, and the story is that he created all these hanging gardens to please her, because she was from Media, which would now be kind of the mountains of Afghanistan, and she was used to living in beautiful surroundings with streams and stuff, so he tried to recreate that for her, and he had the money to do it. So he was a guy that really did earn in fact, the Hanging Gardens were reputedly one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and so on. The report we have of what he did in connection with Daniel and the book of Daniel, and certainly his reports of visions, and Daniel 2 and all of those. The only source we have for that is the Old Testament. We don't have any indication in Babylonian records of any of that, nor would we expect it. But it is interesting that what we know about the story of Nebuchadnezzar certainly is compatible with what's reported biblically. These things could have happened. In other words, it's not as if there's inconsistencies that are so huge that you just couldn't reconcile the two stories. They do have a kind of compatibility, even if we don't have any other record of this outside of the Old Testament. So interesting guy. I think actually by the time he'd spent 7 years as a wild beast out there eating grass and finally got his senses back, I think he probably became a true believer. I think we might see the guy in heaven, but
I find that interesting. Yeah, no, I find that interesting. I've always felt that for all my Christian life, reading that you and what you explain, and by the way, explain a little bit of how the history, the actual history that we have from him changed after that, because I always felt like that you really did see first of all, God said Nebuchadnezzar's my tool, like God is providentially meant for him to be a tool to reform Israel. And then it really feels like, and I'm saying feel because I don't have all the actual evidence, but it feels like he really was reformed himself.
Yeah.
What changed in his history after that maybe seems to indicate it might have happened?
Yeah. You look at Nebuchadnezzar before Daniel chapter 4. That's when that kind of period of his losing his mind took place. You look at him before, he certainly tips his hat to the God of Daniel. I mean, he does typical totalitarian stuff. Everybody is going to respect this God or we'll burn their house down. I mean, it's that sort of, well, that's not exactly a Christian spirit, but after he comes back, as it were, from this beastly, probably 7 years or so of being just out of his tree. The tone of what he says toward the end of chapter 4, that's the last we hear of him really in the book of Daniel, does reflect what at least strikes me as a little bit of humility there for the first time, that he realizes that the God of heaven and earth really is a greater authority than Nebuchadnezzar could ever hope to be. And I think, we speak about Christian regeneration where God changes the heart. I think in Nebuchadnezzar's case, regeneration took about 7 years. And I think when he came back, there was a heart that was there. In fact, later Daniel has a vision, and some people think the vision is actually of Nebuchadnezzar, where you do have a heart that's placed in this individual. So I don't know. I can't. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but it just seems to me you have a little bit of a different tone with Nebuchadnezzar at the end of chapter 4. From that point on, the narrative is talking about others. It gets to Belshazzar, who was like the great-great-grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and you get Cyrus and so on. And then Daniel's visions are the last part. But that's all I can really say. It's speculation, but I think it has at least.
How do we see that in the historical record? Because you refer to some of those aspects of it too. Again, speculation, we grant you, but it seems to indicate maybe. How does that play out?
Well, Nebuchadnezzar, there's a 7 years of silence. So it's like he was on vacation for 7 years or something.
Now, how do we know it was 7 years? They've dated that, and it seems to be that way, pretty close, at least.
Yeah, I'm using that number. It's an extended period.
Yeah.
And whether you could do the arithmetic and say it's exactly 7 years, I'm not sure, because their annals aren't necessarily all that precise.
Okay.
But it's certainly more than a few years. It's going to be in that region, something like that, And Nebuchadnezzar, when he comes back, does seem to be, even in the Babylonian records, a little bit of a different guy. He was much more warring before. There are a couple of skirmishes that take place later, but it does seem that he's less inclined to go out and conquer the world anymore. Now, he's older, but besides that, it seems that there's maybe a difference of philosophy about life that is there. Again, you have to bring something to the Babylonian records, because it's not like anybody's saying this expressly.
Right.
You think you can legitimately infer some of this. It's not incompatible with what's there, but at the same time, it's not as if this is just cut and dried and it would convince any critic that would happen to review it.
Well, let's jump ahead in history just a little further, because this is a close connection in scripture to a real person. Cyrus the Great. By the way,
Hmm.
I am very active on Twitter, and I do Twitter Spaces, which is just a discussion forum type thing. And I've been from time to time talking to folks actually in Iran who are using VPNs to hide
Oh yeah,
because
yeah,
they want to they're those people who want to go back to the Shah and get away from
yeah.
all this. But a lot of people, and in your discussions on Cyrus the Great, you show his temple, or excuse me, his burial place
Right.
in a picture in one of yours. Uh, Cyrus is still greatly revered by the
Yeah.
Persian people, and I think probably for good reason. He's one of the most enlightened
Hmm.
kings and rulers in the ancient world. I guess Alexander the Great you would throw in there to some degree, but not
Hmm.
quite in the way that Cyrus was, because
No.
even though Cyrus did go to war and so forth, he wasn't out just to destroy people's lives. He was expanding and building a kingdom of value.
Yeah.
So tell me how Cyrus historically and biblically connects in, and what
Yeah.
we need to understand there.
Yeah. Cyrus is he was actually a Persian prince when the Medians were dominating, and he wound up defeating his Median, I think it was father-in-law, and was able to take over the whole Persian world. And he does seem to have been an unusually enlightened character. And I don't know what it was necessarily in his upbringing or anything of the sort, but he's treated very cordially in the Old Testament. He's viewed basically in heroic terms in all the reports about him. He's actually called at one point in Isaiah chapter 45 a Messiah. He's called an anointed one, which is pretty high esteem for a non-Jewish person. I mean, sometimes Jewish leaders were called Messiah, the
Mm-hmm.
anointed one. Cyrus is the only non-Jewish person to ever have that designation. But the story of his interaction with Croesus of Sardis, that's the first time you really see kind of something of his character. As the story goes, Croesus knew that Cyrus was going to be in the vicinity, and Croesus, the ruler, he was a fabulously wealthy ruler. You've heard of the wealth of Croesus. Well, this is the Croesus, and he had sent to the Oracle of Delphi, should I go out and challenge Cyrus in battle? And the Oracle, of course, with great studied ambiguity, says, if you fight Cyrus, a great empire will be destroyed. And Croesus, of course, thought he was talking about destroying, the empire Persia. As it turns out, it was the empire of Croesus that was destroyed.
Yeah.
Croesus was about to be executed. And as they were lighting the fire, and the fire was actually kind of coming up around him, but before it had reached him, Croesus looks up into heaven and says something like, "Oh, Solon, Solon, you were right, Solon." And Cyrus is standing there thinking, "What is this? This is," and they had to quickly put out the fire. It's like that in itself, this guy, wait a minute, what is this reference to Solon? Maybe Cyrus knew the name Solon. He was the great lawgiver of Athens, and
Mm-hmm.
thought, maybe I need to take a second look at this guy. So he extinguished the fire and actually hired Croesus to be his lifelong consultant. So Croesus had a job. He went along with Cyrus. I mean, that you just see a little bit of the humanity of him that you would look for pretty much in vain, I think, in other ancient rulers. He was a great engineer. He's the one who famously, the Euphrates is kind of a wide but shallow river at points. And so he built a bunch of canals to drain off water enough to lower the sort of elevation of the river so that the Persian army could sneak in under cover of darkness and take Babylon without shot being fired. And that's the story of Daniel chapter 5, where Belshazzar, who's this kind of arrogant ruler, his dad was out of town, who Nabonidus was the actual ruler, but he'd been gone for some years. And so Belshazzar is there celebrating, and telling people not to worry about those Persians that had Babylon under siege. They had plenty of stores. They could survive a siege for 10 years, no problem. And of course, meantime, the river is being lowered. The Persians come in under the wall, and they're able to just take the city overnight. Belshazzar's put to death, as Daniel says. Well, that's not so easy to do. I mean, I think Cyrus was a little like Julius Caesar, who was a brilliant engineer, and he did stuff like that as well. These guys that are military, but they're also smart. Yeah. They're not just teaching people how to shoot bows and arrows. He knows how to manipulate the environment to his advantage, and then when he finally takes Babylon, he finds this Jewish population there. And as the story goes, Josephus makes a passing allusion to this. And so we think it may be true, but Josephus can sometimes exaggerate things a bit. But he says that Cyrus was shown by the Jewish scholars living in Babylon, that Cyrus himself was named by name 200 years earlier by Isaiah in the book of Isaiah. Now, critical scholars go berserk with that. Oh, that couldn't have happened, blah, 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 But anyway, that's what Josephus says. Mm-hmm. And if that's true, Cyrus, to his credit, realizes that maybe some of his success is not just that he's such a smart guy, but maybe actually he is serving a greater, heavenly purpose here. He certainly authorizes the people of Israel to return, whoever wants to, back to Jerusalem. He authorizes them to start building the temple. I mean, these are all things that speak well of his character. His only stipulation was he wanted all of them to pray for him. So if you're going to build a temple, you make sure you pray for me. And so, I don't know what the state of his heart was. I don't think we have strong evidence that he came to any genuine faith in the God of Israel, but who knows? I mean, these are God's problems, not mine. But I think in terms of the report concerning him, he's a guy that should be respected, and there's good reason for people to this day to be celebrating his memory there in that part of the world.
And that's Nehemiah and Ezra, right? So
yeah,
Nehemiah, if his account is accurate, he had a great deal of respect for Cyrus as well, too, as an individual, because he, through his entire effort to rebuild the temple there, he was not looking to undermine him and draw him off. He just wanted the worship of God to return.
It was actually his successor. Cyrus died in about, I think it's 530. He was followed by his son, who didn't have nearly the intellectual horsepower of Cyrus, whose name was Cambyses. He died in about 22 outside of Egypt. There was a short interregnum in which a guy called Pseudo-Smyrtus ruled. He was a Median. He was a usurper. He was assassinated by a guy named Darius the Persian, and he's famous in the Old Testament. So the prophecy of Haggai and the prophecy of Zechariah take place under Darius, and the return of Ezra and the return of Nehemiah are actually taking place. In other words, the temple is built, it's finished in 516, 70 years after 586. There's the 70 years that Jeremiah mentions. And then a successor to Darius is a king named Artaxerxes, and that's around the year 435. So we're really a ways down the road by the time we get to Ezra and Nehemiah. Cyrus is still remembered warmly, but he's about 100 years earlier by the time we get to the record of Nehemiah, Ezra.
So tell me then, I want to ask you this question as we get toward the end of this. When we look at all these things, when we look at what's happening even in the United States now, but to kind of give us some understanding of how to think through where we're at right now, what do you think is the main way or ways that God shows his character throughout history? And I know a lot of people, we're always going to have, there are going to be some people listen to this that are more critical
Sure.
of ancient history as it relates to Israel, and they're going to scoff at it. I think, it's not that they have no points. There's some things we don't know, but honestly, they shove things aside in ways that are absolutely wrong, just as bad as it is to read
Yeah.
in as Christians things that
Right.
we have no right to read into. But there is a way that God shows his character in history, even throughout the recorded history we have,
Right.
with the help of scripture. What do you
Yeah.
think that is? How does that happen in your mind?
Yeah. Sorry, my phone. My wife will pick that up in a second, so I
No,
apologize
no
for
worries. I can
that.
edit that if we need to. Yeah.
I hope she's going to pick it. I'm going to let it.
Yeah, she did.
Okay, I think she got it. Um, you know, this my short answer to this would be, if you look, first of all, if you look at the Bible as a historical record that has a certain philosophy of life and of God and a certain kind of God with a certain kind of character, and you say, okay, to affirm that there is God is nothing new. Every ancient civilization, of course, affirmed deity or deities of various kinds, Ahura Mazda of the Persia. I mean, you got all of these deities out there. But we say, okay, if you look at the biblical record, is there anything that would suggest that this is just something other than one more example of one more God? And it seems to me that the one thing that really does astonishingly separate the God reported of in the Bible from any other deity of the ancient world, of any description, any place, is that this God is, in a word, holy, and that the holiness speaks to absolute, pure integrity and self-sufficiency, such that this God doesn't need anything. He only gives, but he gives in a way that leads people toward his own holiness. You're going to look for that in vain in the Egyptian religions or any other. You just don't find it. The Gilgamesh epic speaks about God swarming like flies over the sacrifice. I mean, you just have these grotesque pictures. But the God of the Old Testament is really in a class by himself. True or not, anybody reading it would have to say, well, even if I don't believe it, it certainly does suggest this is a unique understanding of the God of history, at least as reported. That God is perfectly consistent with the deity we bump into in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, he's said to be holy, 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 just raising that to the highest level of emphasis. It's repeated in the New Testament. Everything we hear about God in the New Testament is compatible with that same theme. So when you start looking down through history, it does seem that if we're looking for a common denominator that more or less ties together an undergirding theme that is not only compatible with the Bible, but is internally consistent through history, it's that idea. When George Whitefield was preaching, the sermons he preached were sermons that kept calling people back to repentance before a holy God. And that's not to mention Jonathan Edwards, who was way beyond Edwards and way beyond Whitefield in the same way. The work of God in history, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Augustine, the great thinkers, even Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, again and again, you say, if you look for something that ties them together, he keeps coming back. This is a God of holy, perfect, purity, integrity, majesty, power, never a blemish, never something that would raise questions about the character of this, which is never all the other gods, they look like overgrown humans. But this one is kind of in a class by himself. And I guess that'd be the place I'd start to say, if there's a dominant theme that just keeps coming up again and again, God will not tolerate sin. If people disobey God, they will finally pay consequences because he's a holy God. But he's a merciful God. So if we'll acknowledge that we're just corrupt sinners and cast ourselves on his mercy, he will in his holiness give us mercy. But if we're going to harbor arrogance and a kind of attitude that I can get along without you, well, God says, okay, fine. Let's see how that works out for you, so that'd be my short answer to the question. I think it really is the holiness of God.
Absolutely. And stay with me until after I close this up. But I also want to make this point too, in relation to what you said. There are many ways that God's holiness and character show up, even in actual history, when you hear about Israel. It's not deep and full, but it's there.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing you never see of God in history is a caricature of himself. And every God in that is a part of any culture, all these small g gods, they're always caricatured in some way or another. God is never caricatured either in Jewish history or when he is referred to in any form or fashion in actual history. And I think it speaks a lot, and it's subtle, and people won't pay attention to it in some ways because they're critical. But you can't convince everybody. But that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Good point. I do a daily Bible reading in another podcast called Justice and Kindness. Micah 6:8, as you can tell, is.
Now here you're against niceness, but now you're for niceness. Is that right? If I finally got
No. I made that distinction earlier. There's a huge difference between kindness and niceness.
Okay, you win.
Yeah, exactly. Huge difference. But Micah 6:8 is fundamental. It is a good foundational. I hate the 3-point sermon. Like there's something more to life than 3-point sermons, and 3-point sermons usually are designed by men who want to make a point for themselves, for their own self-aggrandizement, than for God's aggrandizement, right? Yeah. But anyway, I go through and I use the McShane's daily Bible reading plan on that. So I've got it going all year long. But anyway, up until this point in the year, we've been in the Pentateuch. And I think I've always felt this way, but it's just been another reiteration for me over the last year of a view of God's holiness that is really, you can't substantially get until you read through the Pentateuch. People will grab out. I remember here, Ralph Reed, who used to run Christian Coalition and runs Faith and Freedom. He's been a good friend of mine since the 1980s. And he was on the Bill Maher show one time I saw, and Bill Maher talked about these, disgusting punishments or whatever, and seemingly unjust punishments in the Old Testament. And then, if you have a sense of the Pentateuch where people like Bill Maher grab that out to try to get you, you kind of miss the whole scope of it unless you go all the way through it. Yeah. And especially when we're not going to talk about it now, but you can get into a discussion of the moral law and the judicial. Sure. There's an understanding of all this that's a substantive discussion. But if you pull out that stuff and don't get a whole sense of what's being said there, you miss what God's holiness is. And because most Christians don't go through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Scripture, sadly, as they should, then they forget what God's holiness is all about. And it is about being set apart. It is about restraining oneself as it relates to others and subduing oneself to God's righteousness. That is badly missing in the church, in my mind today. But when we look at history, I think we can get that sense of this if we look at it honestly and look at it deeply, as we should, and how that would radically transform the interaction of Christians into what this culture. I would love to see that. But anyway, so everyone should go to your website, brucegore.com. Tell us what they're going to find there just before we close down here, and what the benefit of going there would be for them, and also to your YouTube.
Well, I'll tell you, my suggestion, if somebody's just interested, I would say it's more convenient and speedier to just go to YouTube, go to the search bar there, type in my name, Bruce Gore, and I think I'll be the first thing that pops up. And if you click on the picture of my wife and I standing there smiling, you'll get to my channel. And then click the playlists. And of course, I've got quite a few. I think I've got something like, I don't know, 12 to 15 playlists, which are self-explanatory. So at that point, if a person's interested in a Bible study, then I've got stuff on Paul's letters. I'm right now doing the Gospel of John, working through that. I've got this historical stuff on the Revolution, church history, Bible history. So, it's all there. If you go to my website, you'll get the same thing, but you have to kind of poke around a little bit. And I've got some more structured courses that are available through the website, which I've actually ginned up for homeschoolers. So it's not necessarily what would be interesting to just a casual visitor, but that's more the kind of thing you'll find there. So I just say go to YouTube, and it'll be easy enough to navigate from there.
Well, and I'm going to share some links when we put the podcast out to a couple of the videos referenced on some of the topics we talked about, maybe express a couple others. And certainly I'm going to give them the link to your website and also to your YouTube channel so people can do that. But stay with me for a moment, Bruce. But Bruce, I'm grateful for you taking some time with me just out of the blue. I was blessed and honored to be able to go through some of your videos because I'm just a geek on history and knowledge and philosophy and different things. So I'm constantly, I'm 58 years old and I'm still trying to train and myself into learning.
Young guy. I'm 74 years old. So, you got a long way to go, man.
Yeah. Sadly, I'm not that much younger, I guess. Right. We're kind of getting up there, but anyway, I appreciate you taking some time. This has been fantastic information. I hope we can do it again. And I just want to thank you for taking some time with me.
Absolutely.
Thank you.